It's 12 o'clock.
All right, I think that's our cue. Happy Friday, everyone. This is Victoria with A Lonely Entrepreneur. Welcome, happy to have you here. We're just gonna take a minute or two to let everybody jump on. Thank you to those who jumped on last week and supported us on the day of the Juneteenth. And, we took a half a day off to honor that, so thank you. Michael, how you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. There we go. All right, so I just want to give it another minute or two for people to jump on. Michael, so how much talk have you been hearing about pivoting now that we're, starting to emerge and people are starting to kind of come out of the shutdown and, right, thinking about, okay, what do we do now?
Yeah, well, I think it's almost like we're in post-pivot, right?
In a way.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's one of the real challenges that we'll talk about today. I think that the idea of pivoting a little bit in your business and what that actually means. There's a couple of phases to that. I mean, the first phase is, what do you do while the kind of ground is moving around, right? It's very much in line with this whole, theme that we've been talking about, right? Survive and thrive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the pivot you do day one is just, kind of rearranging chairs, right? In a lot of ways, sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively. The real pivot is when the proverbial dust settles, as it's, starting to do, but not really. What does it look like on the other end, right? And so what you might do while you pivot near term can be really quite different than what you do when you pivot
Right.
longer term. And I think that's the real challenge.
Right, absolutely. How did you approach this back in 2008, right? Because here, at least we know that we have phases, or, we have something to look forward to and at some point plan. Back in 2008, right, you had to figure out like what's going on, and there was no road, like there were no phases. You had no idea when this was going to end.
Yeah, it's very similar in a lot of ways to today, V. But I think that the key thing was you always have to look at cash flow, right? So you look at immediate cash, and then you look at revenue and expenses. And when you say, okay, pivot, I was selling to health plans, right? Those were my clients, and we got revenue from our licensing deals with them, as well as the number of incentives that people would earn. And as you can imagine, during that time, to go to a health plan and say, expand your services from the 1 million people that have our platform to 2 million, there weren't a lot of people listening on the other end of the phone because of what was going on.
Right.
So the way we shifted was, well, wait a minute, if so many people are struggling and a lot of them have earned financial incentives because of healthy behaviors, they've earned gift cards and debit cards, which, wow, couldn't they really use that? Why don't we really put a big effort to driving revenue that way by, we could see how many people had not yet gone back and picked their incentives, right? So while we did that a little into our business, but let's say you're a woman that got a mammogram and had earned a $50 gift card, we were actively reaching out to them and saying, hey, listen, you may not realize this, but you have $50 that's for you. So that was just our unique pivot. And, we tried to pivot also, on the expense side.
Right.
Yeah, I've shared the story about, gift cards and all that fun stuff. So
yeah.
You have to look at your pivot comes from, first and foremost, it's no surprise, from how it impacts your cash. But ours was, kind of right next door we pivoted to, because it was just another element of our service. But some of the things that we're going to be talking about today are really these kind of two stages of pivoting, just kind of short-term survival. What do you do to pay the bills, if you will, and then starting to think what I think we're particularly focused on, which is, what does the environment look at afterwards?
Exactly.
In terms of pivoting.
True. Thank you. All right, so I think without further ado, let's get into it.
Great, great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to just pull up a screen and share with you just so we can see some of the things that I'm thinking about. So now that we go into kind of our session around pivoting, there's a couple of different ways to think about it as we started to just think, right? One is, or talk, right? One is, what's your current revenue? What is your current way that you think about your business? What did you think about pre and now, obviously, with the dramatic changes that have come from COVID? How do you think about different ways to rework your revenue, right? The simplest example of that is somebody that delivers a service physically and then transitions that service online. So you're a yoga instructor, you're a music teacher, right? Dot. Easier said than done. Doesn't just happen magically, as many people on the call realize. But how do you do that? And so that's kind of one stage of it. Almost think about the workspaces and incubators that are out there that fundamentally rely on the value of a community and people being together and put together a ton of amazing programming. And now saying, okay, how do we deliver value to our members, today, for example? And that's, a lot of that is obviously the shifting online. The second, which we'll talk about a little bit, is, what we call, for lack of a better word, extensions, which is to say, okay, we've got a certain set of customers, we've got a certain type of revenue. Can we offer a type of revenue that's kind of ancillary to that? So it's not completely new, but it's kind of ancillary to what we're doing today. So, for example, I may have used the example in the past of an accounting firm that provided accounting services to nonprofits. And we were saying, well, okay, what are the ancillary products and services that we should be providing if there's a likelihood that these nonprofits are going to be really hurt and suffering for funding and may come back and cut their expenses by getting rid of an outsourced accounting firm, for example. And in that particular case, we said, well, why don't we help them go get their PPP money? It's not an accounting service, but anybody that's filled out the PPP forms feels like it is, right? So this firm went and created this extension where it started reaching out to its clients and saying, we'll help you get PPP money. We'll help you prepare the reports. We'll help you do the applications. And it benefited everybody because not only did it result in some fees for them, but it also resulted in the solidification of their existing revenue by just extending what they're doing, okay? And then the third is really thinking new, right? Thinking about new markets, new products, new ways of going about things. I think that there are, two examples that come to mind. There's the home builder that, home building, not everywhere, but in a lot of places dried up. But boy, isn't there a great need right now for really cool, more effective designs for home offices, right? Where it just used to be, hey, here's the extra bedroom, or here's the basement, or here's the whatever, where people go, the way people have been living. But wow, couldn't we do something that's really much more sleek and effective and in the home office area? The other is childcare. One of the big problems that's going to exist, obviously, especially as you hear more and more about what schools are going to be doing in the fall with, sometimes students are in the building and sometimes they're home doing online. Think about how childcare is going to have to change. If you had a traditional childcare facility where you're bringing kids there, that's probably not going to exist. And so ask yourself the question, how could we deliver this service at home? Is there another way to deliver service that we haven't thought about? We even had a conversation, I don't know if you remember it, we were talking about, state and local governments, under such pressure right now and so many financial burdens coming from all this. And, just like in 2008, there was a big discussion about consolidating firehouses and police houses. So, why do you need, where you live, Victoria, right up in outside of Boston, why do you need a fire station for every town? Like, why does it have to be a different fire department every town? Why isn't there just a big county one or state one, and there'd be all these synergies and there'd be all this cost savings? And so somebody said the other day, well, if schools don't have enough room for the kids, we don't need all those firehouses. Why don't we just make firehouses into second schools? So
I think I run into some safety hazards, but
there'd be a lot of fun stuff to play with at school, of course. But and those and one of the things you realize too in times like this is that this is not, you don't go one for one. You throw 10 ideas up on the board and 8 of them might be really dumb, right? But the one that sticks has to have the ability to tap into where money is already being spent, right? And that's a big part of thinking about these new markets, right? If you're a home builder, there's going to be demand for offices. If you're, right, you know, is you have to take a step back and say, what are the new products? And this is not groundbreaking, right? What are the new demands out there? What are the new types of products and services out there? I mean, think about this. Think about how many kids right now between the ages of, you know, 6 and 16 can't go to camp, can't play with their friends. So what's the solution?
Mhm.
Right? Somebody who solves that, right? We were working with somebody that ran a business that was completely decimated by this. They've been running basically sports camps throughout the year, right? In Long Island and New York City, right? Camp after camp, basketball, soccer, baseball, girls softball, field hockey. That's what they do over and over and over again. So imagine, and they have a limited space for each camp. For each camp, there's, let's say, 50 kids and they pay whatever they pay. So imagine that business, right? Completely decimated going into the summer, which is one of their busy seasons. And we started talking to them and said, well, what are some of the things that the kids like? Like one of the things, and of course there's the instructional part, but one of the things the kids liked was they would always have some kind of athlete or celebrity come, right? And speak at the camp. And these were usually like week-long camps. But the problem was there's only 50 kids at the camp, and they always had all these people that wanted to come that weren't in the 50 that wanted to come when the athlete or the celebrity was coming. So we said, okay, why don't we do that? Let's just create online, right? And instead of selling it to 50 kids, let's sell it to 500 kids, right? And so they started booking athletes that would come on, and the athletes would talk a little bit about their career and a little bit about instruction in the sport. But it was just, and now they're doing better financially than they were when they were running their camps every week because they don't have any operational cost, right? So this requires a lot of, you know, we always talk about this, you know, entrepreneurial creativity around a lot of these different types of things.
Yeah, listen.
Okay, so go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of creativity, right? I'm seeing a lot of college graduates, right, who had a lot of internships lined up, and obviously a lot of these things fell through. So speaking about summer camps, I see a lot of posts, especially like around my town, where they're reaching out saying, "Hey, I'm a college grad. I've done these sports. I played on all these teams. I can come and hang out with your kid 4 hours a day in your backyard or somewhere out in the field." And, you know, they're trying to make the use of time and earn some money and help parents out. So it's a win-win on both.
Well, I don't know. Some of you may be aware of what we did with Lonely Entrepreneur. We, as you know, created the free Entrepreneur Survival Guide, and our goal was to try to get it in the hands of as many people as possible to try to help. And we enlisted a bunch of college grads who had, through my alma mater, Bucknell, and some other places that the same situation had internships that weren't going to come through, and they were either college kids or college grads, and got a bunch of them, and they've been actively getting it in the hands of entrepreneurs that need the help. So there's new opportunities that come, but obviously there's some foundational things to think about when we go after all of these. First of all, let me stop it. Any questions, or I'll kind of get going?
I think we're good right now. We're a couple, but I'll ask them as we go a little further.
Okay. So let's start with the first kind of slice of this, which is your existing revenue. Okay. And when you think about your existing revenue, there are, hey, I just continue doing the things the way I'm doing them now. There are techniques to kind of play with your existing revenue in a way that is going to be quite different from the way you've done it before. right? So for example, if you think of, okay, I'm a customer and I have an accounting firm and I bill people hourly, right? And clients come back and say, well, no, we just, there's no way we can afford that now. There's no way that that's going to work for us right now, right? Is there something that we can do to ultimately enable people to pay differently, right? Do we, very, very basic, right? Just, you're not talking about reworking your whole program or your whole pricing structure, if you will. You're talking about just simply, you know, coming up with different ways to help them, you know, finance what they're doing. Okay. Even to the point of, you know, people have gone out and gotten 0% credit cards, right? And paid their vendors with 0% credit cards because they don't have to pay, you know, interest on their credit card for, you know, 15 months or 18 months. Okay. So very linear, just one step in a direction about, you know, kind of how you help people pay. Then you start to think about, okay, if my ultimate customer needs my service, but can't find a way to pay it because they're under such financial difficulty, can I take it and still take the service, but maybe spread it out over a longer agreement to say, listen, you are paying $5,000 a month for this, you can't afford that. Here's what I'm going to do. We're going to sign a contract that says for 2 years, you're going to pay me $3,000 a month. And that way, and I'm going to still provide the service at the same level that I provided it, but in exchange for that, when you come out of this, I'll be there with you on the other end. And, you know, you're locking in, you know, revenue, which is $72,000, which is not that much more, but you're also facing the potential risk of losing a client. Okay. So when it comes to your existing revenue, you know, these are just little pricing twists, turns, and then other options like bundling in more services, right? One of the biggest challenges now, a lot of times the people that we're selling to, they just have a certain limit on dollars. They just have to cut their dollars. So you could give them everything and it wouldn't matter, right? Just because they have to get to a certain number of cash that they can spend, you know, regardless of how much extra that you could give them. But as in my example of the accounting firm, if you can do something that is really value creating for them, you know, then maybe that isn't as clear as I just stated it. So when it comes to your existing just pricing models and packaging of those pricing models, give it some thought. Are there ways that you can more closely align to the cash needs of your customers around the way you just price? Okay. Secondly, you kind of the next stage of this is, okay, now I'm going to shift the way I deliver my current product or services. And what I would suggest to you, and we're going to talk a little bit more about in the end, is that because so many people not only have, but have already shifted their businesses online, you have to understand that online as a differentiator no longer exists, right? Just to be online, right, is just table stakes. You just need that to get on the ride. What you do online is really the rub. So if you're a yoga instructor and you've got a great following and your classes are packed and now you're saying, okay, well, I've got to transition this online. How do I do that in such a way that is going to be differentiated from all other yoga studios out there? Okay. What I would suggest is this, that when it comes to these things, you have to take your ice cream cone, in my example, a yoga studio, and add a different type of sprinkles. Okay. Don't just add sprinkles that are yoga plus, right? Start to think of the demographic of your audience, not just the service that you deliver. So let's say particular yoga demographic was, you know, women aged 30 to 40, let's say. Well, those women aged 30 to 40 probably have children, right? And have children that are stuck at home. So could we create something linear like kids yoga classes? Or could we deliver something to that audience that doesn't necessarily have something to do with yoga, right? But enhances the experience with your company. Okay. The problem is this: if everybody just changes their revenue in this type of very mini pivot, right, and just changes their revenue to what everybody else would do who's in yoga, right, then don't you face even greater competition because everybody's doing the same thing and now so many more people can do it. It reminds me a little of, if you remember back in the day when music used to come out and they have to, an artist would have to sign with a record label. And the only way for them to get distributed is to go through the record label and get on the radio and do all that fun stuff. And then pretty soon the artists started to realize that they worked very, very hard to get a record deal and they had to tour for years and years and didn't make a lot of money. And they're like, we're going to reduce this. We're going to release this directly to the public. And they started to build up followings directly with the public. There's a good and a bad to that. The good is it eliminated the need to have to go through these kind of bigger companies to control your destiny. The bad is anybody can release music. So the democratization of music, which seemed like a great thing and made these bands, right, have the ability to touch directly to the consumer. But now all of a sudden, somebody in his basement can release music and you're competing with all of that. So what I would suggest in this first slice of it, which is your existing revenue, is you can't just go and say, I have vanilla ice cream and I can put chocolate sprinkles and I put rainbow sprinkles. Like, you have to think outside of the box in terms of what are the other types of things that are kind of ancillary to the types of services that you're providing. And they don't even have to be that close to it, right? They just have to say to your demographic, there's another reason to have a community with us. Remember, one of the things about a physical facility, you know, I mentioned workspaces before and yoga studios, is there's really a community there. People embrace the opportunity to be together and to share some of that time and spend time together. So you lose that. So how do you continue to create a greater sense of community? Well, one of the ways you do it is you solve more of their problems than just their yoga, right? If you said your business was originally a yoga studio, and then you said, okay, tomorrow you're allowed to have your existing customers. So you have 500 customers, let's say, and there's only one rule when you think about your business going forward: you can't provide yoga. Go. What would you do? Right? You would look at that group and you'd say, I have, in my example, women aged 30 to 40, this demographic, they have kids and they get, what could I provide them that they need? Okay. So the linear pivot of, okay, just put it online is just resulting in, it's good for some people and it's resulting in some good things for some people, but it's got to be more than just what everybody else is doing, because then you're just kind of sitting there thinking about, okay, well, everybody else is doing what I'm doing, so why am I different? And now all of a sudden I've introduced myself to many more competitors than I ever had before.
Yeah, Michael, that's great. So one of the questions was actually, you know, what is the thought process? What is the creative process? You know, how do you actually begin about thinking your product or service when the normal deliveries no longer apply, right? So in your case of yoga, right, if somebody had a yoga studio or a business or a service where constant interaction with, you know, customers and clients was the normal, right? So going online is not enough. So in your yoga case, you know, could they, you know, one of the differentiators, you know, could they maybe offer a nutrition class on top of that? Or could they offer a class, you know, with kids at the same time if they have somebody who can lead that?
Yep. So here's what I would say, and this is a little bit of an extreme, but I think there's two things that people have to really do. Number one is go as far away from your business and your first thought process as possible. So for example, your example, my example, Victoria, going online and nutrition classes and yoga for kids, those are all valuable, but those are kind of right next to what you do, right? They're like right there. They're like naturals, right? Mm-hmm. So when you think about it, that's not to say you're not going to end up there, but when you think about it, let's think about it a little further afield, right? Let's think about it a little bit wider and broader than that, right? So if we helped you design your home office, from my example before, right? Moms are at home, they're not going to work, they're not commuting, the kids are around, whatever. We're going to help you design your home office, and we're going to bring in somebody that's going to show you how to do that and give you some, like, that might not be the right idea, but then you'd say to yourself, V, right? To your question, you'd say, how many yoga studios are providing this service?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so nutrition's good and yoga's kids good, and those may be all natural things to do. And there's going to be a lot of people that'll be successful at those. What I'm suggesting is for the question from one of the people on the call, how do you think about it? You got to think about it as if you couldn't even deliver the service you deliver right now.
Right.
But you still have this target audience, and you said, okay, my company makes $25,000 a month, and I do this through a bunch of yoga classes. How do I make the same $25,000 a month if I can never deliver a yoga class today? What'll end up happening is you'll think that way, and you'll come up with one or two ideas that come from this kind of different way of thinking, and then you'll integrate it into some of the more traditional things that we're mentioning here.
Right. So not to be cliche, but really thinking outside the box, right? So you don't, it's almost like think of a complete.
It's not a box. Like you can't think outside the box. It's not a box, right? Like you have to. And the second part of that is the people around you, right? It is very difficult to put 7 yoga instructors in a room and say, let's all think about how we don't do yoga together, right? You should be taking advantage of your advisors, your board, your mentors, your partners, your neighbor, people who are smart people who you can go and say, hey, I'd love to get your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And throw them in a room for an hour and brainstorm and give them the problem and say, hey, listen, we've got relationships with 500 women between age of 30, 40. If think if we were in a business school class or a business school interview, right? Someone would say, you have to generate $25,000 in revenue from 500 women, and you used to be a yoga studio, you can't do yoga, go.
Right. Right.
Like typical MBA interview, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People from the outside just aren't restrained by our, as you said, V box, right? And I think that's one of the critical elements of trying to do that stuff.
Right. True. Thank you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about, sorry, I'm hopping around a little bit. So we talked a little bit about, the simple stuff, right? Alternative delivery, pricing and packaging, offering the same customers different products or services. And, if you have really good relationships with clients, you can have these types of discussions about the different products and services they need, or you can get out in front of it like the PPP stuff was a natural. And then I think another, kind of mini pivot is what market that you're going after. As everybody who's had anything to do with lonely entrepreneurs, we always talk about this notion of a playground where nobody else is playing. And I think that in my example, we're talking about, okay, you have a series of women aged 30 to 40, and that's your typical demographic. And let's say different exercise, let's say you had to deliver yoga. Who's another target market that you can go after? Is there a segment that's been created by what's happened with the pandemic? Is it, as you said, Victoria, kids that are stuck at home, mm-hmm. right? Obviously, there's lots of people, men and women, who aren't commuting, right, anymore, right? There's lots of professionals in certain types of industries. It reminds me of there was a wellness company that was providing wellness solutions to small to medium-sized companies. And as many of you know, who've been around the healthcare industry, there's tons and tons and tons and tons of wellness companies that go into corporate America and say, we can make your employees healthy and save you money. And this particular wellness company was struggling. What they did was not that unique. And as we talked to them a little bit, it turned out that the CEO had been a former IT professional, and that a good amount of programs that they developed were actually with the IT profession in mind. So if you think about the typical, I mean, it's probably stereotypical now, but the stereotypical IT professional, sits a lot, is on the computer all the time, drinks a lot of coffee, right? Mm-hmm. And the like. And they delivered a program specifically for this one company that was largely technology driven. I'm like, why wouldn't you sell that to every company? Go in there and say, we're the ones that get your IT professionals. And as you know, many of them have lots of them. And so they developed programming that was specifically for that target market, and they started to really break through. So obviously the impetus for that was just winning business, not necessarily a pandemic. but the same applies, right? Looking at, what we're going to talk about next, which is the markets that are buying and the markets that are thriving. And they're not just bigger markets, but they just may be pockets of individuals, right? That are no longer commuting to work, that no longer have the vehicles and the outlets that people are looking for, and the like. So going after a different target market can be a significant opportunity. Okay. Any questions, or should I keep going?
Keep going. No.
Great. Now, when we look at macro trends, which is another kind of step of this, right? When we look at, we're talking about, okay, what does your current learning look like? What are kind of extensions and not necessarily natural ones, right? Then you start to look at new ways of delivery, right? And looking at new products and services. Now, at a high level, right? No surprise to everybody. This is, think about all the people that are thriving during this time, right? And obviously there's many more online services, Zoom and places like Peloton, that are all a function of, the nature of the dynamic that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
But when you take a step back and you say, okay, what is going to be the demand? What are the big things that that people are going to need? I mean, we just had a conversation with a company that was doing 3D printing for all kinds of different stuff and was applying that to PPE stuff, right? Amazing, right? So you have to think about where is the demand coming from the bigger macro trends that exist. So for example, there's a lot of talk in New York City, where I'm from, that nobody's sending their employees back to offices anytime soon. Number one, you have, obviously, everybody's on top of each other. Number two, people have gotten used to not commuting, and it's very difficult to get on a subway or a bus or a train. And so everybody involved doesn't have a lot of reason to bring people back. And you're like, okay, but there's going to be reasons why and needs for people to be in the same place at some point, right? So there's now this emergence of this, I don't know if this is the right term, kind of flex space, right? Where you'll have, instead of renting an office building where you have 5 floors, you'll have flex space where you'll have 100 spaces where people sign up, and a lot of the consulting firms use this model. But the difference will be is it may not be in Midtown Manhattan for somebody to commute in. It may be, you may have one in Long Island and one in New Jersey, and where people commute from. So there's going to be emerge this whole need for a more flexible and more locally, more located, space. And that's obviously a big market that's starting to evolve, right? And when you think about what those markets are, you think about the inability to be in offices. You think about, obviously, food has evolved very quickly and will continue to evolve. You think about the home office stuff we said before, but you also think about, what does online learning look like for kids going into next year? I mean, virtually every educational institution is going to be delivering learning online in some way, colleges and younger, of course. What does that look like? Doesn't it have to look like a much more sophisticated way of doing it than had been done, that had to be done in last minute, over the course of this early spring?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, massive amounts. And when you think about, okay, what are the supplementary services that have to be delivered to, for example, grammar school kids or high school kids, when they're not going to get the same experience? What can colleges deliver that are, not dependent on physically being there, right? And obviously a lot of that's being shifted online. And one university I heard yesterday professors had to justify why a course needed to be taught on campus versus online, as opposed to it used to be the opposite, right?
Yep.
Justify why a course has to be taught online. But the question isn't just that. The question is, what are the other ways of delivering this stuff that isn't just purely online or in the university setting, right? There's some creative things happening on college satellite campuses that were always kind of looked at as the secondary campuses that now are becoming super important because they can be used as kind of facilities to to handle, you know, kind of smaller volume. So within each of our industries, right? You know, for example, in the food industry, a lot of the way people got consumers to get to know a product in a place like a Whole Foods is by sampling. You would go in there and you'd have people that would show them and give them the opportunity to taste the food. I mean, that's not coming back anytime soon, right? So there's these fundamental shifts in the way that people interact in offices and schools and supermarkets and, you know, all these different places that we all need to take a step back and think about, you know, what are these pockets of demand that are going to exist? Certainly, another one that started to emerge is just a series of home services. You know, it's one thing when people are in and out of the house all day. It's another thing when everyone's locked in the house, excuse me, for hours and hours and hours, right? And there's ways that you have to live that you hadn't had to live, you know, in the past before. So again, take a step back, bring in some outside people that are really smart and that think differently than you think about it, and start to think about, don't worry yet about a product or service. And that's obviously counterintuitive to us entrepreneurs, right? Because a lot of times it's very much around the product and service. But if you're in the survival mode, right? Survival mode is, okay, how do I get the revenue I need? Maybe it's from my existing customers, maybe it's from an extension of that. But part of that journey is going to be, what are the new pockets of demand that have existed? You know, another one that comes to life is, think about the travel market. Think about how many people are going to be driving, right? Mm-hmm. And think about, you know, if you've ever seen a truck stop from 20 years ago and a truck stop from now that serve truckers. A truck stop from 20 years ago is the cliche, bad food, right? Dingy hotel. The truck stops now are literally like 5-star hotels. They've got massage services and places to sleep and amazing food. And I mean, you could basically live there. So when we have so many more people that are going to be on the road traveling, you know, not flying to places, isn't there a whole package of services that are going to have to be evolving, that isn't just a hotel, but might be a whole bunch of other things?
Yep. Michael, so one of the questions that are naturally coming up is around raising money, now that we're talking about new markets and, you know, new services, right? Because it's almost starting from scratch in a way. So how do you approach that?
So it's ironic, right? Because I'll describe something to you. Somebody comes to the table with an idea that has never been presented before, and they're presenting it to an investor. And isn't that what we all do as entrepreneurs every day? Right. So I don't think that's the challenge. I think that we all do that constantly. I've shared the story many times that when we started rewards in healthcare, not only did they tell us that it not existed, they told us they would never do it.
Right.
And these were senior people at senior roles. So that, I don't think that's the issue. I don't think it's that we have to tell somebody that something's not been done before. I think that the more fundamental issue, two fundamental issues that you have to overcome. Number one is, what does consumer demand and business demand look like for a set of products and services, given what's happening in the economy, right? If you could have a brand new car for tomorrow, but if so many more consumers are out of work and their 401ks have been decimated and, you know, blah, 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 how many more people are buying cars, mm-hmm. right? So I think the demand side. And then the second is that there is a degree of hyper competitiveness for products and services. So the things that I'm going to reiterate a little bit from our revenue call a couple of weeks ago, which I'm going to reiterate at the end of this call, is the fact that you have to convince investors that you're going to win against competition in a way that at an even greater height. I think it goes right back down to finding a playground where nobody else is playing, right? There are doubts and demand in traditional places, but in non-traditional places or new places like some of the ones we had mentioned before. Do you think that somebody wouldn't fund into building home offices? Right, huge demand.
Right.
Right,
Of course.
would somebody not fund into solutions that help deliver learning more effectively
Mm-hmm.
to a bunch of kids?
Mm-hmm.
What would the moms on this call do to get their kids stop running around the house and ranting and raving all day long? Right, was there any amount of money that wouldn't pay? Right, so um, there's a whole bunch of investment in the pet community. So what I would say is this: pre-COVID, we were getting in a more and more competitive world. It's
Mm-hmm.
harder and harder to be successful as an entrepreneur because the technology moves so fast and the money moves so fast and dot, dot, dot. In a post-COVID world, those factors have just been exacerbated. And so you need to be able to answer the question, are we riding a wave, or are we pushing against a wave?
Mm-hmm.
And in the two things that I've personally been involved in, I always felt that that pushing against a wave just required a lot of capital. And so rewarding people for being healthy, we were basically saying every healthcare company on the planet is trying to get people to change their behavior and be healthier. We're just going to ride that wave, right? We're going to deliver incentives to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Lonely Entrepreneur, right? We are just simply trying to help people with the struggle, right? And that wave isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And
Right.
we hope it would, right? That entrepreneurship
Right.
was just easy and you could just come up with an idea and come up with your version of cookies and everybody would buy it, right? But we all kind of giggle when we hear that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you have to be riding waves. It's going to be hard to convince investors that you can create a wave in this environment, because what people have to realize in the funding sources out there is there's so many things being cut that if you work for a large company, you're being asked to do so much more, right? If you work for a venture capital firm, you're being asked to do so much more. So the resources are going to get allocated even more towards the real winners. And so you have to define, if you're selling to consumers or selling to businesses, you have to define playgrounds where you're going to win.
Mm-hmm.
Just because those demand cycles are going to be really, really challenged.
Absolutely. Now, this actually leads me right into the next question we have is, what about, someone's asking, so we go through the whole exercise of trying to pivot, right, and change everything. And then, let's say 2, 3, 4 months, we're kind of back to quote unquote normal. Then what? Like, how do you handle that exercise? And, how much do you really go left?
Yep. Great question. I really do think of the real pivoting part as your longer term thinking. I think the short term, it's survive and thrive, right? Like any one of us could create different business models for the next month or 2 or 3 months, but it's really what you do longer term that makes the difference. So I think it should almost be looked at the other way, is that do what you can, use bubble gum and duct tape in the short term, right? And if you have to deliver a service for that client or do whatever, you do that. When it comes to your fundamental strategy, when the dust settles, you've got to be able to sell into a market or deliver a product service that has sustainability, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that it's not the other way around. It's not I pivot into something and that's my strategy and then I figure it out later. It's more piece it together, right? And in the short term, and use different pricing and different positioning and all that different stuff that we talked about. But longer term, think about where is demand, right? If you're selling into a market where there isn't demand or demand has been significantly reduced, which, there's a lot of markets like that, you have to rethink it. It's almost like, the restaurant that says, okay, we'll do delivery only is obviously a start, but that restaurant should then ask themselves the question, what if I could never open my restaurant again? Right? Could I take 10 of my meals that people love, right, and prepackage them? Whatever it may be, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's one place that we were working with, full service, kind of like New York, kind of diner deli type of place. Now the only thing that they do is small things. So coffee, tea, smoothies, soups, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that way they're set up for that when it's really hot out, right?
Right.
They're going to do a certain thing. When the fall comes, they're going to shift it a little bit to soups and coffees and teas. And when it like, so it really is, I know it's cliche, survive and thrive.
Right. And as we always say, right, these type of things and finding a playground where nobody else is playing, they're not meant to be, easy, take 2 seconds, think about it, up, snap your fingers and here you go, right? These are really hard thought processes and kind of reiterations and to kind of tap into that deep-seated entrepreneurial creativity that I think we all possess.
100%. And sometimes they're surprising, V, because, if you go back to rewarding people for being healthy, there were so many loyalty programs at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a retailer. I mean, this is only the year 2000. There wasn't a retailer or a bank or an airline or a hotel that didn't have a loyalty program. When we looked at healthcare, in some ways, it's really, really far afield. It's an industry that nobody had ever thought about reward programs in before, right? And yet it was right next door. So that's why you kind of throw up on the whiteboard first, right? And then kind of work yourself backwards. But what I would say is, I can't tell you how many times people have said, but our technology is a little better and we added this one little thing and we added that one thing. Unless you have $1 trillion of marketing to make people really understand what that little thing is, it's really, really hard to get people to pay attention to what that little thing is.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even Quibi, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Quibi, originally started out with, they're going to create 7-minute videos, billions of dollars investment. Marissa Mayer from Yahoo and a bunch of other Hollywood icons. And the whole idea is we live in such a cluttered world, we move so fast that we're going to create, content that's 7 minutes originally. And then a pandemic hits, right? Mm-hmm. Now they've changed it to 10 minutes, but still they've been struggling a little bit. So even with people with all the money in the world, right? Which is, if you saw the financing behind that, it's been significant. I think that we all do have to really think about, what are the things that are kind of outside of our sphere of thought right now that we deliver that adds value given the demand trends that are going to exist.
Absolutely.
I wanted to just leave us in the last couple of minutes. I wanted to reiterate 3 fundamental principles that we shared on the revenue call a couple of weeks ago, because I think these are really the rub. When you ask yourself the question, we keep saying, finding a playground when nobody else is playing. That principle, as well as the 2 others, one is that you have to define a criteria where you win, right? And thirdly, which is how much your knowledge and your know-how has to come through. So I want to just go through them really quickly, because the basic premise is that when the dust begins to settle and when it ultimately settles, there's so many more people competing for the same dollars, right? There's so much more competition. And so finding that playground is incredibly important. Finding a spot. Now, it may have to be a small little niche, right? But you have to define it, own it, price it, and set the rules for it. It's almost like your own little city, right? And you create your own little city and you set the speed limit, and the speed limit is not 55, it's what you think it should be, right? And you get it, define it, and win it. And it might be small at first, but it's super important that you do that in a hyper-competitive world. Secondly, is defining a criteria by which you win, right? I've used many times the Budweiser example. If you haven't seen the Budweiser commercial from the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, I encourage you to look at it. It's about corn syrup. A lot of times the criteria that you define, right, is not really even a criteria that your buyers ever really thought about, right? It's just something that makes you different. And that's not in any way to suggest that any of this is disingenuous, right? It's the way that you package and position your product around a criteria, where you win, right? There are people out there that are mad scientists that sell technology, and Some of those mad scientists should win because the mad scientist runs it, and that's the criteria that you win. And you should say, well, if you don't have a mad scientist running your car company or running your company, then you shouldn't buy from this person. Like, define a criteria where you win, and then try to convince the marketplace that that is really the criteria that matters. You know, the corn syrup for beer example is, I mean, corn syrup has never, and will never be a buying determinant for beer, but Budweiser figured out how to change that. So don't forget about defining criteria where you win. And sometimes that criteria, everybody, comes by being in a market and learning it, you know, as you get deeper into your playground. There was a wellness company that was delivering services, and like the other one I mentioned before, struggling, and we talked to them a little bit, and it turns out that they had been doing a lot of work with the Hispanic community. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. Not so unique, but interesting. And as they talked about the program, they said, yeah, we didn't realize that there were a couple of things that were really important in getting this community to respond. And we're like, what were they? They were like religion and transportation. We're like, what? They're like, if a pastor in a church told them not to eat pizza, they would not eat pizza. It's like, okay. And in many communities, transportation to healthcare facilities was a huge problem. So in their, and don't get me wrong, some of these are cliche and some of these don't apply to, of course, to the whole Hispanic community. But the point was, they gained insight that all of a sudden they would go to a health plan and they would say, any program that doesn't have transportation and doesn't involve religion is going to fail. They set a criteria by which they won because they had already started to do it. Okay. So find a playground, set a criteria where you win. And then finally, which is this whole notion of know-how. It's the very simple example I give, that if any one of you told a friend that was staying over your house one night who was about to go for a jog to get some exercise, hey, when you make a right on Main Street, remember there's a pothole 100 yards down. Those are the types of things that people pay for, right? You know, not knowing, making mistakes, not knowing where the traps are. That know-how makes a difference. Now, that know-how has to be really, really aligned to the things that sit in the minds of your buyer at a high level. So if it's selling to a company, what sits in the minds of the CEO of the company that you're selling to? What sits in the mind of a consumer that really makes a difference, right? If I'm going to have a business where I recommend, or I'm going to throw a dinner party, right? And I'm going to throw a dinner party for my colleagues, my business colleagues, and I pick the wrong wine for the food. Does that hurt my career? Well, I mentioned that example because we worked with a company that was essentially a gentleman that had cooked hours and hours and hours in the kitchen and drank way too much wine, and had paired the wines with the foods across hundreds of meals and said, everybody's doing it wrong. And when he originally presented the idea around, okay, we're going to educate people better about it, I was like, but wait a minute, you can go to the New York Times and there's a million places that will tell you, if I'm cooking a certain meal, what wine to pick, and how are you going to cut through all that? We positioned it as, we're going to sell to the serious home cook that's entertaining and doing things like, you know, colleagues and friends, and doesn't want to look bad, right? And we're going to talk to them about, you can ruin your career, a little bit of an exaggeration. But there was a know-how that came from all that work that he had done, right? To say, unless you know, what would you serve with this? Because if you serve this with something, you would align it to this wine, because that's what you would hear in the best restaurants in the world, right? And that's wrong, right? So that know-how has to come through in everything that you do, in your sales, in your marketing, right? And if you don't have that come through in a hyper-competitive world, it's very hard to stand out. In every one of our businesses, we have that know-how, right? And I'll leave you with a final example. For my healthcare business, we ran a program where women, men and women, but were rewarded for reducing their waist circumference. They didn't want to use weight for whatever reason. They use waist circumference, where you measure your weight. And if you measure your circumference of your waist and you go to your doctor, and your doctor would validate it for you, you can earn some incentive. Well, it turns out that one time a woman who was pregnant went into her doctor and said, "Hey doc, I want to get my incentive." And the doctor said, "Well, you can't, because the rule is you have to be, for a woman your height, you have to be here." And she's like, "I'm pregnant. That's discriminatory, blah, blah, whatever." Called up the CEO of Aetna, went nuts. And so in the future, now we obviously hadn't cared for that, but in the future we did. And so when we would go to the next health plan, we would say, "There's 3 things you better not do." And we would kind of off the cuff say, ask a pregnant woman to measure her waist circumference. And they would all kind of laugh and then kind of go, "Whoa." And we would say, "There's 100 of those that can get you, your name on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for all the wrong reasons." So know-how where if you walk out of the room, right? Could be a stylist, could be a hairdresser, could be a yoga instructor, could be a business, could be a software provider. If that person walks out of the room because they have a know-how that you have to have as a buyer, that gives you the ability to align your revenue to something they go, "I have to have that," right? So anyway, finding your playground, setting a criteria, and using know-how to lead.
Yeah, the know-how is a really good point. I think real estate agents make a great example of that, right? Because anybody can show a house, but the real estate agent who brings you in says, "Look, the school is 0.2 miles this way. There's a really nice, cul-de-sac here. There's 5 families with kids your age. The hair salon is, 0.5 miles away. The body shop for your car," right? It adds a very different perception because they know what they're talking about.
And B, it's in this world, because we are hyper competitive, all those things that you just mentioned, which are incredibly valuable, those almost become table stakes, right?
Right.
Like anybody that showed up that didn't have all that, right, might not even get on the ride. So what's the next level of that, right? Like, is it, what is the thing that protects some kid from going into the wrong field? Like, but that real estate agent that buyer would go to the next real estate agent and say, "Tell me about the neighborhood."
Right. Exactly.
And if they didn't bring that level of capability, so we're not going to win in a hyper competitive world on features and benefits, right? Nobody is paying attention, and people are worrying about their health and their families and their lives and their jobs. Nobody is paying attention between this product has these 10 features and this product has these 10 features. You got to make people go, "Ooh." And if somebody goes, "Oh man, I would not have known that." It's happened in New York real estate where someone's about to buy into a building and they're like, "Why is this so cheap?" It's because the tenants sue the landlords all over the place in this building, right? Like but that know-how has to be raised to another level in hyper competitive times.
That's great. Great insights as always. A lot to digest.
Thank you, everybody, for taking a time out of your day. I wanted to remind everybody that, and I'll show you quickly here, within the Entrepreneur Survival Guide, all of these weekly fireside chats are all posted and recording here, and everyone will get this one today will be posted here, but we've got the ones we were just talking about revenue we handled, we talked about a little bit earlier in the year. There's some really good stuff here about negotiating. And this particular session will be in there by end of the day today within the Entrepreneurial Survival Guide. So thank you very much. And V, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say we're here to answer any questions either in the community or just reach out to us directly. We're happy to obviously get into some of this and help you at every step of your journey. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
It was a great weekend.
Have a great Friday.